Okay, so now I'll push the play button as we count down. Oh,
a channel that's dedicated to exploring those kind of fringe elements, but also.
oh dear, I've made the right mess of this again. But you can all see me now, can you? You can say yes.
Yes.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, that's really good. So we're now live, and we're now working through the text. Just a little a kind of note. You can, if you type comments in the chat, you'll notice they will appear in the little chat box up above. You can try that out if you like. I'm going to paste in there the text that we'll be using. So if you want to have a copy of it, let me just do that now. Control copy and control. Oh no, hang on. Where's the? There we go. So if I put in the. Oh, no, it's not going to do that. Oh, copy. Oh, do you know, I'm having difficulties right now trying to paste. Okay, I'm not going to do that because we've got it on text here. Pardon? Did someone say something? Oh, I missed it. Okay, tell you what we'll do is I'll keep going through the text, and at the end, once we've stopped streaming, I'll try and paste it into the copy and chat. I think I originally intended to try and do this session before we stopped at summer, and it all got very confusing as to when we were supposed to be live and when we weren't. So my apologies if you came along and there was no one here for this. The passage we're at in Matthew is kind of really interesting. Well, I think it's interesting because I really love trying to fit the Gospels together. It's not just an exercise of trying to prove to myself that the Gospels are true. I actually find that the challenge of trying to do it actually sometimes makes you kind of see through them in a way where you kind of get much more of a real perspective on the nature of the story. And there's a little bit of that in what's quite a straightforward passage. It sort of acts in the Gospel of Matthew as we have it as an introduction now to the real ministry cycle that Jesus is involved in. We've had so far, we've had the way that Matthew's gospel has gone. He's presented the genealogy. Well, that's something that if you think of it, of Matthew's gospel being started sometime shortly after the day of Pentecost, as the church is kind of exploding all over the place. And people need to start to have something to meet around, and we're tying in with the statements from the early church about how Matthew's the first to try and coordinate it. And so when we read in the book of Acts about the apostles teaching and devoting themselves, what they're doing is working on the official narrative of the story of Jesus. And so shortly after the day of Pentecost, you've got an awful lot of people who are aware of Jesus. They're aware of the big ministry. So, and as we've kind of gone through Matthew's gospel, the genealogy is important, but it's not something that people would generally be aware of. But it's kind of useful in those sort of ways. And the birth story, which is clearly drawn from Jesus's family, is important. So again, it's not something people would instantly be aware of. John the Baptist, of course, they all have been aware of, and we're going to touch on him again this morning because he comes into the text. And that then sets up the temptation narrative. And as we've gone through all of those events, we now come to what in one sense would be, is perhaps in my thinking, is probably one of the earliest bits of Matthew ever written. I suspect it was one of the first chunks of Matthew that is issued around the kind of the nascent church as it's emerging. And because it allows people to fit their experience, because of the masses and the crowds would have been aware of the ministry of Jesus. They may have even been in a crowd somewhere and seen him in some distance as those things that pushed around him. And it kind of collects a lot of that experience and some of the experience that they have had as they come into encounter with the early church, which is of course moderated through Peter, who is preaching, and the apostles who are right there at the heart of it. And so we're going to see that that this little kind of passage effectively launches Jesus's public ministry. So we're now moving from stuff which you probably wouldn't have known about. And as I think about how the gospel has developed, you can see how Matthew is kind of issued in episodes, which makes sense. This is perhaps one of the early episodes. And what it actually does is it allows a lot of that early crowd in Jerusalem to kind of feel like, okay, I can start to fit my experience of Jesus and my knowledge of Jesus, which I've heard from gossip, I've picked up because I've talked to somebody, I've done something like that, and we start to fit them all together. So if we come here, we're going to start reading. So now when Jesus heard that John had been arrested, he withdrew to Galilee. So we've got a statement. As I said, the crowd knows about John, and of course they know about his arrest. They also know about his execution, but they remember his arrest. And this again, it kind of puts the story into context. I put a little map. Oops, hang on, it's going the wrong direction. Let's go through here. If we read John's gospel, which of course has not been written yet, so the crowd generally aren't aware of John's gospel. But in John's gospel, we've picked up that Jesus has been with John. There's been various things going on. He's been referred to as a rabbi within that context. And then in John's gospel, Jesus kind of breaks off and John makes way for him, and he leaves the south of the River Jordan, right down at the base near the Dead Sea. And he heads north to an area called Salim of Ainon, which you can see with that little red dot on the map to the right. And that leaves space for Jesus to baptize, and there's huge numbers coming, and they're coming out from Jerusalem after Jesus has been doing some teaching around the feast period season that runs kind of from Pentecost from Passover through Pentecost. Is a long season where loads of pilgrims are coming down and they're crossing over. So Jesus is making a big impact, and this is before Jesus' real public ministry, but he's now beginning to have this big impact. It says that the Pharisees started to notice him because he's making more converts, or he's baptizing more people than John the Baptist was, but we still haven't really launched his public ministry at this stage. We then follow Jesus up into Samaria, and it's probably in this transition through Samaria as he then that actually John is arrested. So during that transition through Samaria, John, who's been in Salim or near Ainon, which you can see if you compare it with the map on the right, probably puts him in Decapolis. We're not exactly sure, but we know roughly the area. We can anticipate it. Ainon just means, I think, wells or waters, and Salim is quite a common name, so it's difficult to place it exactly, but it seems to be in the northern region with that little lip of Decapolis that crosses over the Jordan. John, who's been there, presumably now moves up into Galilee proper. Because, of course, if he's been arrested, it basically means he's come into the jurisdiction of, hang on, let's go back. Oh, no, yeah. Sorry, still getting used to how these, if I go back. So John's been arrested and Jesus withdraws to Galilee, but it's probably because John has strayed into the territory that is owned by Herod Antipas. So I think, no, I didn't put them up. The Herod Antipas controls Galilee, and he controls Perea, but he doesn't control the Decapolis area nor Samaria, which are the two possibilities for where Salim is. So John has obviously moved, and he's now wandered into the territories that are controlled by Herod Antipas, who is the person who is annoyed with John, of course. because John has criticized his marriage and taking Philip's wife, and so but of course while he's in an area that's not, John doesn't have any jurisdiction over, it's difficult to do any arresting. So we can kind of assume that John has now moved up, he's now been arrested, and that becomes, if you like, the trigger point. And probably in the flow of Matthew's gospel, what's quite nice is it kind of shows a correct relationship between Jesus and John. We read in John's gospel, which of course people don't know because Matthew is being written first, about how John acknowledges and says he must decrease and Jesus is going to increase. But here in these early days, it's kind of flagging, well, we all know about John. John had a key ministry. in relation to Jesus. We've had that story. Jesus has come down, been baptized by John. There's a good, solid relationship. And Jesus is real, if you like, the globally public ministry. Although we read in John, there was a lot of stuff going on. There's this handover transition period. In Matthew's gospel, it's now being presented as after John's arrest. And that's often the way we think of how Jesus' ministry starts. But of course, as we know from John's gospel, there's been a whole lot of backstory, a whole lot. Interestingly, as while we're thinking about John, Matthew's gospel and Mark's gospel, the two earliest gospels written, talk about John first coming in the wilderness and people coming down to him in the wilderness. Luke's gospel talks about dates quite precisely in the 15th year of Tiberius. John comes out of the wilderness, and then he's baptizing people out of the wilderness. and it's one of those kind of little passages that sometimes you read, people say, oh, there's a contradiction. You know, Matthew and Mark say John was in the wilderness, and Luke says he came out. Haha, got you. But it's quite useful because it helps us understand the beginnings of John's ministry, and that helps us understand the beginnings of Jesus's ministry. In that it's difficult in the modern world. We're used to lots of publicity. When's this going to come? When's this going to come? When's this going to come? And bang, there it is. In the ancient world, things start small, and people hear stories, and actually to pin a precise date as to when John the Baptist ministry starts is quite complex. And so to try and piece all the bits together, what you create is a story which isn't explicitly told in the Gospels, but makes sense of all the different moments, which is that actually John has been teaching in the wilderness, maybe for some years before the 15th of Tiberius. And during that period, people are coming down to him, and that fits what we know more broadly from just trying to think who the Roman historian was who talks about the Essenes and people coming down to them there in their and maybe John has had some association there. So people have been coming down to him because he's a slightly eccentric looking guy, you know, dressed like Elijah, living in the desert, teaching in the desert. And in that context, he may and very likely has encountered Jesus over the years. And because Jesus is not married as a 30-year-old, which almost certainly means that he has marked himself out in some way with a vow of celibacy, which people did do, but which means that he's already committed himself to his own development and learning and so on. And so he's likely to have interacted with John in that way, which then makes sense when he comes to John and John sort of says, well, he knows him. I do know you. I don't think you really need baptizing. you get the story. Now, why am I saying that? Is because actually in a similar way, Jesus's ministry, the beginning is difficult to put a precise date on. We've seen he's already engaged. Well, we will understand as we pick up the later Gospels that there's been more that goes on before his public ministry than we perhaps realized. And you kind of integrate them all together by understanding that what Matthew is doing here is creating this first kind of précis summary. And so all of the verses we're looking at, we're going to see a kind of capturing in broad terms something that you might have been aware of, but because of the way our minds work, we look to kind of fix it on a particular date. And then we find contradictions if it doesn't quite fit with when we've done a similar thing with Luke's gospel. Say, for instance, giving you an example. So so John he's probably moved up into Galilee. He's been arrested, and as the text puts it, so Jesus now he starts his public ministry, and he starts it in Galilee. But again, Matthew runs through these events. Having left Nazareth, he came and lived in Capernaum on the seacoast in the region of Zebulun and Naphtali. Well, again, if you look at Luke's gospel and John's gospel, we find that while he's kind of ministering in Galilee, there are a number of things. We're told that he's going around their synagogues, but he's presumably, although he's got disciples, they're not necessarily all traveling with him. I say it that way because I think that's part of the reason why they don't really write about this period, because Jesus re-meets some of them when he goes and moves to Capernaum, which is referenced here. In moving to Capernaum, Jesus reconnects with Peter, Andrew, James, John, and Philip, who's just a town over. He just is a little bit further to the east. But in John's gospel, in Luke's gospel, we read about him in Cana, Canaan again, returning to Canaan in John's gospel, and we read about the miracle of the royal official comes looking for Jesus, which means that Jesus has already been healing people. We've read about some of that when he was down in Jerusalem, but presumably up in Galilee. And so there's a period here which in our minds disappears, where Jesus has kind of come back into Galilee. He was on his way into Galilee when we heard John was being arrested. He comes into Galilee, and in that context, he's going to various places and various things are happening, but it's all summed up here in Matthew. He's going to leave Nazareth. We read about that in Luke after he's preached, and they try and push him off the precipice, and he then comes down into Capernaum. But Matthew is summing all of these things up. Having left Nazareth, he lived in Capernaum on the seacoast in the region of Zebulun and Naphtali, fulfilling what was spoken through Isaiah the prophet. So before I go to what Isaiah the prophet actually said, the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, that on the sea road, or the Via Maris, beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. So one of those nice little points, which I'm sure many of you are aware of, that little phrase that comes out of Isaiah, the sea road, or the Via Maris, is actually the name of the road that runs up the coastal line and then cuts across and into Galilee, that the Romans built. So hundreds of years before the Romans built the Via Maris, Isaiah is prophesying about the people who live in that region. People sitting in darkness have seen a great light, and to those who sat in the region, the shadow of death, on them light has dawned. And so Matthew kind of draws in this prophecy from Isaiah, and it says, and from that time Jesus began to preach. You can't quite read it, so let me just turn to the side and to say, think again, for the kingdom of heaven has drawn near. So there is a kind of a launch of Jesus's ministry, and at this stage, as the way Matthew's presenting it, it's probably taking months, if I can put it that way, at least months, where Jesus is perhaps now working in that Galilee area as a visiting speaker at various synagogues. In terms of what we know about the synagogues, the skeptics used to say, oh, well, the synagogues didn't really take off until after the destruction of the temple, so they're out of sync with the Gospels. But we now know, we found various synagogues, but they're not as big as we perhaps sometimes think they are. There are handfuls of public buildings that are acting as synagogues, and some of them probably are just really large homes. They're just kind of homes that are adequate for gathering people. But we do know they exist around Galilee at the time, and Jesus is therefore, it seems, visiting these and teaching in them and praying for the sick, and he's developing a reputation, all being kind of summed up. And that's all kind of happening probably to the west of the Sea of Galilee, but in that region, which very much is the Via Maris, you see, which is perhaps why he's quoted it, the sea road, as it's called, which runs from the real coast of the Mediterranean and into Galilee. So it's in that kind of a region where Jesus is to start with, but then he relocates to Capernaum. And he's teaching the similar message to John. Behold, the kingdom of heaven is here. There's Naphtali and Zebulun. So it's in that kind of region from the Mediterranean across, where the Via Maris comes up, the way of the sea, and arches across the top. So walking beside the Sea of Galilee, he sees two brothers. So what Matthew is doing is he's presenting stuff that people are vaguely aware of. We know about Jesus. He didn't start until after John had been arrested. That's very honoring. He was commissioned by John. He's initially working in that area to the west of the Sea of Galilee. He relocates to Capernaum. Walking by the Sea of Galilee, he sees two brothers, Simon called Peter and his brother Andrew. Well, we know those guys because they're the ones who preached on the day of Pentecost. Peter is the guy who's regularly standing up and speaking in the portico of Solomon. So it's useful to introduce him. So Matthew is introducing him, giving us the story, which actually happens as in the process of Jesus relocating to Capernaum. So we put it together with Matthew and Mark's Gospels. And but often we've heard this story as if Jesus has never met Peter before, which he has, of course. But what hasn't happened is that Peter hasn't left his business, leaving his nets. That's the thing. Jesus is kind of saying, right, come and follow me full time now. You've been following from a distance, you've been working with your nets, but now we're going to do something. And this is the beginning of these tours that Jesus is going to do. There's a cycle of tours which build up the huge crowds. But actually, even when he arrives in Capernaum, it tells us how a crowd greets him. So, and that crowd, of course, is because of all of the work that he's been doing, synagogue to synagogue. He's beginning to get a reputation up in Galilee. So he sees them, calls them, and immediately, having left their nets, they followed him. And having gone on from there, he sees two others. We put the story together in Luke's gospel. You can see, we see how it works, but I won't try and do that now because trying to keep to time. Let's try and stay to time. But it seems that, remember, there's this massive catch, this miraculous catch, and actually it's a very complicated, at the top of the Sea of Galilee, where the river Jordan from the north flows into the Sea of Galilee, of course, creates all kinds of currents. So the fact that two boats would be out who are both involved in the miraculous catch and then try and land them, they seem to land a little bit apart, which is why he comes to one boat first and then has to walk on. Well, that's actually natural, because you've got the flow of the Jordan coming into the north of the Sea of Galilee. So actually kind of pushing against the natural flow of the water to land. It's not surprising if the boats aren't exactly the same spot. And they immediately left their boats and their father. And it's interesting that Zebedee is named. It implies that Zebedee has some status. Now we will pick up later that Zebedee's wife is a lady called Salome, who is possibly the sister of Mary, the mother of Jesus. But even if she's not, she's massively significant in the early church. And actually, you find kind of one of the early kind of critics was a Roman historian who writes about the different sects of Christianity about in the 2nd century. And he refers to those who follow Salome. So Zebedee's wife has become one of the significant women. She's there as one of the women who follows Jesus from the times of Galilee. And so perhaps as a couple and as father of two of the apostles in that early church, they've got some significance and standing. So Matthew names him in the gospel. James and John. James, who's the son of Zebedee, you see. So okay, now I know who he is, because we know that couple and we know the apostle, and we're putting them all together, and it's helping me understand them all. So they leave their boats and their father and they follow Jesus. So then we read, and so what Matthew's done, again, as we see it, put it together, it's after John the Baptist. Now Jesus is kind of coming. We know that he's been doing some stuff in Nazareth, but we've just kind of glossed over that. There's actually quite a few months where he seems to be based around there, Cana, Nazareth, and so on. Then he relocates to Capernaum. At Capernaum, he's drawn his first disciples together. That makes sense, because we know about Peter and Andrew. We know about James and John, and perhaps as well their parents, which is why they're mentioned, Zebedee. They seem to be significant to the church. And then kind of Matthew kind of then takes this next cycle, and Jesus went about in all Galilee. And what he seems to have done here is he steps back again. And this is actually a very common way of writing, a kind of Hebrew Aramaic way of writing, where you move forward, but you sort of cycle forwards. So here it is. It's after John the Baptist's arrest, he comes into Galilee. He's based in Nazareth. He moves to Capernaum, and there he calls the disciples. But then we kind of go back, Jesus going all about all of Galilee, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the good news. That's actually kind of, if you like, what's just gone before. We've kind of cycled back, and then we cycle forward, you see. And that actually you find is not at all uncommon. We find it in Luke's gospel as well. It's one of the reasons why we find it in the Western mindset so difficult to fit the gospels together, because we'd like to think that everything's nightly lead out in a single line like this, rather than kind of continual. So we never go back as far. We kind of just go back a little bit, and in one sense you can understand that if you're issuing the story in episodic ways, it's kind of like when you watch a television program and they have last week what happened was. There's a little bit of that going on, but I suspect that this whole pack was kind of put together as a single summary of the start of Jesus's ministry. So he has been going around in all of Galilee, and he is going to be going around all of Galilee. So I tell you about the fact he's going all around Galilee, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the good news. healing every disease and sickness among the people. That's already been going on even before he moves to Capernaum. And the report about him went into all of Syria, and they brought to him all who are sick. Now that as an event isn't really going to happen for a few more months. But you see, this is a kind of a standalone summary. It's a précis summary. It's kind of covering how the thing started and where it's going to go in the first phase, and rather than it being an event that then stops and then we move on to the next event, which is the Sermon on the Mount. It's kind of summing them all up, because it's in that later phase we're finding that everyone is sick, is now being brought to Jesus, and the crowds are really enormous. So we do pick up when Jesus moves to Capernaum that there are big crowds there, but by the end of it, they're absolutely enormous. So you can see that the way Matthew's been putting these things together is actually, it's really this whole unit stands as a kind of almost, you could lift it out and you could send it to a kind of a home group, a home synagogue, and you could discuss it and people could relate their experience, because it kind of captures the beginnings of Jesus's ministry after John the Baptist. Starts out with some stuff that was based around Nazareth and in Galilee, in the western side, Zebulun and Naphtali. But actually it's going to then, he relocates to Capernaum, which actually allows him to kind of call his disciples to now travel with him. So not just to be relationship with him, but now they're going to travel with him, and we can do that cycle again. This time it goes a bit further. We're going to read about him going into Syria, which is further north. And we're going to hear about him going further east, and we're going to hear about crowds bringing so many sick people. But that's still to come in Matthew's gospel. But here in this précis is all kind of included in the way he's put the whole package together. So final verse, I think it is. And great multitudes from Galilee, Decapolis, Jerusalem, Judea, and from beyond the Jordan followed him. And that final statement makes you realize that we're now kind of, if you like, reaching into the future, which we haven't got to yet. Now, as I say, I wanted to draw it out. It's the kind of thing we gloss over, but it's because of this, when you try to fit the Gospels together, you start to see this kind of pattern. But it makes sense if you think about it, that you can write all of this in a single page, and that single page can be copied out and distributed to various different groups who are all looking to understand the life of Jesus together. And it's got things in there that they can relate to because their experience has meant that they have encountered. They've come up for the feasts over the last 20 odd years. They've been aware of John the Baptist. They've been aware of everything he did. They've been aware of the stories of Jesus. They may have even encountered him and seen him from a distance from time to time. They've come on the day of Pentecost, or they have heard about the day of Pentecost, one of the two. They started to get involved in the learning of this church that's growing in Jerusalem. And so here's something that as we read it and we think about it and we share our stories, that actually you can start to build a common understanding, a common narrative of the life of Jesus from that, which is the point of why I think Matthew's gospel gets written. So hopefully you can kind of, you see that, as I say, I tend to think of this passage as almost, if you like, the original opening for Matthew. Whether it really is or not, I don't know, but it seems to me to be a good contender for the first chunk that that has been written by Matthew. It's kind of like the bit that holds people's experience as they have it, with the story that's going to both come, and also from what we've looked back in the last few weeks, some of the details that establish why Jesus is so important because of his birth lineage and the prophecies that have been fulfilled in it, and the way in which he's responded and reacted. And the Baptist ministry makes sense because he is there to prepare the way. If Jesus has been learning under John, Jesus has been washed and baptized under John, Jesus has been effectively receives his commission under John. All of those things that have kind of happened before are now kind of all being drawn together in this sort of précis summary. Don't know if that's contradiction in terms, a précis and a summary, as they all get drawn together. And then what we're going to now then start unpacking is how this final verse is made real. This final verse, great multitudes from Galilee, Decapolis, Jerusalem, Judea, and beyond the Jordan are going to follow him. That's going to happen. It's already happened in embryo. Now it's going to happen big scale as we unpack the next few chapters. So that was a bit of a lightning run through those verses, but Would anyone like to ask anything or state anything at this stage? No. No one wants to share or ask a question?
Can you hear me, Kristen?
Yeah, I can hear you, Colin.
Oh, yeah, because I've got my headphones on. Well, it's a question not necessarily related to this specific passage, but it's regarding Matthew's note taking.
Right.
What would have been the way he would have taken notes in that? I mean, I presume they wouldn't have had notepads and things.
No. So I think, yeah, I was going to say I know I've touched on this in some of the other live sessions we've done up in London. So the Romans invented the kind of little wax tablet. So people actually kind of had their reusable tablets. So you had a wax tablet and you made notes on that. And then of course you just kind of leave it out in the sun and smooth it all out. And you can do it again the next day. So you make notes as you go on a wax tablet, and then you transfer them to something more durable. And then you can reuse your tablet. And so almost certainly as a tax collector, he has been trained as a note taker. So we know that there's a number of kind of technical scribal skills that are so Matthew, of course, is from the tribe of Levi. It's probably his real name is Levi. As I suspect, Matthew might be a bit more of the nickname. But so he is a Levitical scribe, and he's actually sold out, he's used his scribal skills for the Romans, and using probably some of their technologies and developments, which include things like shorthand. Well, that was a Roman development, it was a Greek development, but they've then a way of teaching people to make notes quickly using the wax tablet in a little wooden frame to make your keynotes on, and then you review it, think about it, write down in more permanent form, and store that somewhere that's less portable and won't get damaged so easily. So I suspect there's something of that process. How perfectly he does it, we don't fully know, but that's the kind of background and skills that he does have.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Does anyone else want to ask anything? No. No. So we can see you now, Barry. I think for a long time you were just a kind of an image.
Hi, Chris. One quick thing. I know something about Syria here. Is that the same as Assyria? Because I always got the Assyrian Empire. Is that now gone? I mean, Syria is now modern
Syria. So Syria is of course much more kind of coincident with modern Syria. It's the Roman province of Syria, which right. Probably I don't know the full etymology of the name. It probably has some connection with the fact the Assyrians did push into it, but the empire was further north and further to the east. The actual Assyrians, but they pushed round the top of Galilee and down. So I suspect, and which includes what we now think of as Syria. So I suspect the naming has got something to do with it. But
all right, great. Yes,
it's the Roman province,
right?
The Roman region. Anything else anyone would like to ask or comment on? No, no. I can, every now and again you see people start to move fingers and think, oh, what's going to happen? Well, what I'll do is I'm going to finish the live stream, and then we'll pray together before you disappear from your lunch